We don't need a vaccine. There, I've said it. I feel like I'm saying the emperor has no clothes. Scientists worldwide are working on a vaccine, but best estimates say it will take a year to develop, at least. Do we have an alternative? Our government officials, healthcare professionals, and journalists don't seem to think so. They've almost universally accepted the idea that the only way to actually end the pandemic is to have a vaccine. But history, science, and the facts on the ground for this very pandemic say that is 100% wrong. We could end the pandemic in 3 months without a vaccine, without a cure, and without knowing any more about the coronavirus than we know right now. When the pandemic got scary, we latched on to having a vaccine as our only path to salvation. So when we finally got around to thinking about alternatives, we were tripped up by cognitive bias. Cognitive bias reinforces our preconceived beliefs by causing us to only see and give credit to information that confirms those beliefs. In addition, it causes us to overlook or reject any information that contradicts them. In this case, it means that almost no one seriously questions the belief that the vaccine is the only way to stop the pandemic. I know it's very difficult to put aside these innate gut-level reactions, but I'm going to ask you to do just that for a few minutes. I want you to see how it is completely within our power to stop this pandemic now, and how doing so is far less dangerous and far less costly than waiting for a vaccine. First of all, stopping a pandemic is not rocket science. It's a logistics problem. The only thing you need to do is find a way to keep those who are infectious from transmitting disease to those who are susceptible. Humans have fought pandemics that way throughout recorded history. However, we don't have to look back in history to see that it works. We have absolute proof that we can end this very pandemic without a vaccine. In early June, less than 3 months after their first confirmed coronavirus cases, New Zealand drove their case numbers to 0, and now, except for international travel, they've returned to normal daily life. No mask, no distancing, no crowd restrictions, and no fear. They've not had a single death from the coronavirus since the end of May. Now, when we hear about New Zealand, our cognitive biases lead us to overlook or discount what they did. We immediately start looking for all the differences between us and them and construct justifications for why we could not possibly do what they did. I've yet to hear anyone say, hey, if they can do it, we can do it. Okay, so let's look at an example that is much harder for us to dismiss. New York. Here's a graph of the number of new coronavirus cases per day in New York State since March. The number of new cases peaked at over 11,000 a day on April 9th, and the virus was killing close to 1,000 people a day. By June 9th, just 2 months later, New York was down to under 900 new cases a day, less than 9% of their peak. This was done without a vaccine, without a cure, and in the face of an overwhelmed healthcare system. New York used the same basic testing, isolation, and hygiene techniques that New Zealand used, and New York really didn't have access to adequate testing during that time. This was a stunning achievement. In a very short time, under the most adverse conditions possible, we were stopping the virus. In fact, kicking its butt is a better description. And what happened? No one noticed. No one said, look, we can beat this thing. Okay, but if we're beating it, what happened here? Why did the curve flatten out? Well, nothing happened with the virus. It did not suddenly get harder to stop. What happened are all these green lines. They represent reopening events, like reopening beaches. The curve stopped going down because we gave up. If we had delayed reopening for a few more weeks, the curve would have kept going down and hit 0. Before the end of June, the pandemic would have been over in New York. Their only worry, like New Zealand, would have been new cases coming in from the outside. So what can we learn from New Zealand and New York? They show us that stopping the pandemic without a vaccine would take about another 3 months. We know more now, so it would not require a complete stay-at-home shutdown, and it would not be as costly as the first shutdown, but it would be very costly. Also, the states would have to coordinate their efforts because, while we can strictly control travel at our national borders, we can't effectively do so at state borders. Given that it would cost a lot to end the pandemic without a vaccine, maybe it's better just to wait for a vaccine. Well, the main reason we shouldn't wait is that the virus will not stop doing what it's doing now. It has only reached a small fraction of its potential victims, and it doesn't know or care that we're tired of dealing with it. The terrible conditions we have now are going to persist until the end of the pandemic because, as Arizona, Florida, and Texas, and many other states have recently proven, significantly easing the restrictions doesn't work. Let me take a second to point out something in these charts that's easy to overlook, but is extremely important. It's what's happening here. These declines show that we know exactly how to change our behavior in order to stop the spread of the virus. If we kept these behavior changes in place, in 2 to 3 months, the virus could be completely eliminated. However, we're so focused on the idea that we have to have a vaccine, we ignore this clear proof that we can stop the spread of the virus wherever and whenever we want to. The ongoing cost of waiting for a vaccine is huge, and the damage it is doing to our economy will grow as time goes on. To think that another 3 months shutdown to end the pandemic would somehow be more costly than what is going to happen in the year or more it takes to get a vaccine defies both economics and common sense. Finally, the most urgent reason not to wait for a vaccine is human loss. Projections show there'll be over 79,000 additional deaths by the end of October. When the pandemic started, we all thought that it was inconceivable that our total losses might be that high. But now, we've simply normalized that loss as the cost of doing business for the next 3 months. Also, and this is the part I find most shocking, we have stopped even talking about trying to save them. I hope I've helped you step outside the vaccine is our only salvation narrative and understand that we can use the tools we have right now to end the pandemic. All of us, but especially government officials and medical professionals and journalists, should be fighting to let people know there is an alternative to our current tragically ineffective and massively costly approach. It's an alternative that history, science, and our experience with this very pandemic have proven will work. If we use it, in a few months we could be looking forward to a normal holiday season, instead of looking back on a huge economic loss and the graves of over 79,000 of our neighbors, friends, and family members.